Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video explores an alternate version of events and characters in a reimagined storyline. This presentation is structured and adopted into an audiobook style format with narration and visuals to enhance the experience. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
This alternate universe story is written and narrated by Fantasy Reimagined. Chapter 36. A Marriage Deferred. The war councils had grown louder, more crowded, and far more insistent. Where once maps and troop movements dominated the tables, now parchments bearing sigils, lineages, and marriage prospects were spread alongside them. Robb Stark, king in the north, stood at the head of the long table in Winterfell Solar, listening as bannermen debated not battles but brides. The pressure was relentless. Every victory against the South had brought not only confidence, but expectation. Allies wanted permanence. Lords wanted assurances that the North would not fracture once the war ended. And in Westeros, no bond was considered stronger than blood joined by marriage. Robb felt the weight of it settle heavily on his shoulders. Catelyn Stark sat among the assembled lords, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral. To many, she was the voice of reason, the keeper of tradition, the woman who understood the old ways of alliance and obligation. And she did, perhaps better than anyone in the room. Yet beneath her calm exterior stirred something far less measured. Fear. Not fear of loss, not fear of grief, but fear of displacement. Jon Snow's influence was everywhere now, in the way captains deferred before speaking, in the pauses before bannermen offered counsel, waiting to see whether Jon would nod or remain silent. Even when he said nothing, his presence shaped the conversation, and Catelyn saw it clearly. The North was beginning to orbit him. She would not allow that. The North needs certainty, Catelyn said at last, breaking the murmurs. A marriage secures loyalty in ways victories cannot. The lords will follow Robb now, yes. But what of later? What of succession? What of peace? Several bannermen nodded in agreement. Robb turned to her, his brow furrowed. I know, Mother, but this war isn't finished. Binding myself now, choosing a bride for leverage, rather than trust, could cost us later. Catelyn's gaze flicked briefly and unwillingly toward Jon. And waiting, she replied evenly, can cost us now. Jon stood near the edge of the chamber, hands clasped behind his back, silent as ever. He had spoken little during the meeting, but Robb knew everyone knew that silence was deliberate. Jon never entered a discussion until the moment mattered most. When Robb finally turned to him, the room stilled. What do you see? Robb asked. Jon met his brother's eyes, gray on gray, mirror to mirror. I see traps, he said calmly, on all sides. A ripple of unease passed through the council. If you marry for love, Jon continued, you risk alienating houses who see it as weakness or sentiment. If you marry for leverage, you risk resentment, both your own and your queen's. Either choice made too early fixes your path before the board is fully revealed. Catelyn's lips tightened. And if he delays, she asked pointedly, if he refuses all offers, that too sends a message. Jon nodded. It does, but it is a message of control, of patience, of a king who will not be rushed into binding decisions while enemies still maneuver. He turned slightly, gesturing to the maps. The South is watching. The Vale is watching. Even the Iron Islands are watching. A rushed marriage invites manipulation. A delayed one forces them to reveal their intentions. Robb absorbed the words in silence. He trusted Jon not blindly, but deeply. Jon had planned for his survival, anticipated disasters before they struck, and preserved the North against betrayals no one else had seen coming. Yet Robb also felt the strain of command, the constant demand to be decisive. I won't choose now, Robb said finally. Not for love, not for leverage, not yet. Relief flickered across some faces, frustration across others. Catelyn's expression did not change. But inside, something hardened. Later, in the quiet of the stone corridors, Catelyn confronted Jon. You speak as though you understand the weight of rule, she said sharply. Yet you do not bear it. Jon inclined his head. I bear a different weight. You undermine tradition, she continued. You encourage hesitation when decisiveness is required. Jon met her gaze steadily. I prevent mistakes when pressure demands speed. Her voice dropped. You place yourself too close to my son's authority. The words were no longer about propriety or lineage. They were about power. I place myself where the North survives, Jon replied. Nothing more. Catelyn studied him, seeing now what she had long feared. Not a boy seeking acceptance, not a bastard grasping for status, but a mind that could outmaneuver kings. Her resentment deepened, not because Jon threatened Robb, but because Robb listened. This was no longer a matter of social discomfort, it was political. That night, Robb stood alone on the battlements, staring out across the snowbound fields. The war pressed in from every side, demanding sacrifices he was not ready to make. Marriage would come, but not yet. Behind him unseen, Jon watched the horizon as well. Some decisions, Jon knew, were not about choosing the right path, but about refusing the wrong one until the future revealed itself. And for now, the North would wait. Chapter 37, The Crown's Teeth. The Iron Throne had never felt so uncomfortable to Joffrey Baratheon. Its twisted blades pressed into his back as he lounged upon it, fingers drumming against the armrest, gold rings flashing with each impatient movement. He hated the whispers, soft, constant, unavoidable. Courtiers murmured of northern victories, of battles won without spectacle, of a bastard commander whose name crept into every conversation like wrought in stone. Jon Snow, the name tasted foul. I want a victory, Joffrey snapped, his voice echoing through the throne room. Not a report, not a promise, a victory people can see. The courtiers stiffened. No one met his gaze. Ysera stood at the foot of the throne, calm and composed, her green eyes sharp with calculation. She had learned long ago how to interpret Joffrey's moods, not merely tantrums, but signals of political necessity. The crown was bleeding authority, and visible dominance was the only salve her son understood. We will give them one, Cersei said smoothly, but it must be unmistakable. Her solution was not subtle. Orders went out to Lannister commanders across the Riverlands, crush resistance swiftly and publicly. Villages suspected of aiding the North were punished. Crops burned, hostages taken. Lords who hesitated were reminded, brutally, of where the crown's power lay. Cersei justified it to herself as necessity. Fear was currency. Fear kept men obedient. Fear had kept the realm together before. But this was not the same realm. As the crackdown spread, so did stories of Lannister cruelty, of soldiers who took far more than taxes, of punishment delivered without trial or reason. Refugees fled northward, carrying tales of suffering with them. Neutral houses that had wavered now saw clarity in the choice before them. The crown's teeth were sharp, too sharp. Far from King's Landing, Jon Snow read the reports with grim certainty. This was exactly what he had expected. Lannister brutality was predictable, not in its form, but in its purpose. When threatened, they struck outward, believing terror could compensate for strategic failure. Jon had anticipated the response weeks earlier, even before Joffrey's demand had been whispered through the court. And so he had prepared, quietly. Northern envoys were dispatched, not with threats, but with sympathy. Food caravans followed refugee paths. Medical aid arrived where Lannister forces had passed through. Jon instructed his messengers to listen more than speak, to offer shelter without demanding banners in return. Let the contrast speak for itself. Letters were sent to minor riverlords, carefully worded, never accusatory. We understand your suffering. The North does not forget those who endure. Winter remembers kindness. No demands, no ultimatums, only opportunity. The effect was devastating. Houses that had once leaned toward neutrality began refusing Lannister levies. Supply lines slowed, scouts vanished, small acts of defiance multiplied, not coordinated rebellion, but quiet resistance. The crown's authority did not collapse in a single blow. It eroded grain by grain, trust by trust. Joffrey, upon receiving reports of stalled progress, flew into a rage. They fear us, he shouted. Why do they not kneel? Cersei said nothing at first. She read the reports herself, eyes narrowing as patterns emerged. Northern aid arriving just after Lannister forces withdrew. Refugees speaking well of the Snow Fox. Lords citing northern restraint as justification for delay. It was not coincidence. It was strategy. Jon Snow was not merely countering her brutality. He was using it. The realization chilled her. For the first time, Cersei understood the true danger Jon posed. Robb Stark won battles. That could be countered with armies. But Jon Snow was reshaping perception, turning cruelty into weakness, fear into sympathy, and strength into overreach. He was fighting a war beneath the war, and he was winning. She began issuing more controlled orders, attempting to rein in excesses. But it was too late. The damage was done. Every attempt to moderate now appeared as inconsistency, every act of mercy as weakness. The crown's teeth had bitten too deeply. Late one night, Cersei stood alone on a balcony overlooking the city, the lights of King's Landing flickering like dying stars. She clenched the stone railing, anger and unease twisting together in her chest. He planned this, she whispered to herself. He knew exactly how we would respond. For years she had dismissed Jon Snow as a peripheral threat, a clever boy perhaps, but ultimately a shadow behind Robb Stark. Now she saw the truth. Jon Snow did not need a crown to wield power. He needed only his enemy's nature. And as the winds shifted across the realm, Cersei Lannister understood something she had never before admitted. Not even to herself. The North was not winning because it was stronger. It was winning because Jon Snow was smarter, and the crown, for all its teeth, had never learned how to bite without poisoning itself. Chapter 38. The Game of Coin. Tyrion Lannister had always believed that wars were won long before swords were drawn. Coin, contracts, debt, hunger. These were the true weapons of power. Armies merely acted out the final act. And as Tyrion studied the ledgers spread across his desk in the Tower of the Hand, he understood with growing clarity that the North could not be broken by force alone. So he chose coin. He began subtly, as all good economic wars must. Trade licenses to northern merchants were delayed. Riverland caravans suspected of supplying Winterfell were subjected to inspection fees. Bravusi factors were quietly encouraged to raise interest on loans tied to northern houses. Mercenary companies that once considered northern contracts suddenly found better-paying opportunities elsewhere, generously subsidized by Lannister gold. No declarations, no proclamations, just pressure. Tyrion watched the numbers shift with satisfaction. Grain prices in the Riverlands crept upward. Iron shipments slowed. Wool exports stagnated. If winter tightened its grip, the North would feel the strain first. They always did. Let us see how clever the Snow Fox truly is, Tyrion murmured, swirling his wine. Jon Snow felt it within weeks. Reports arrived not as crises, but as patterns. A delayed caravan here, a merchant contract dissolved there, rising prices that could not yet be called alarming. Lesser commanders might have dismissed it as the chaos of war. Jon did not. He ordered immediate stockpiling. Grain was seized not from the people, but from surplus holdings of bannermen, redistributed fairly with meticulous records kept to ensure repayment after the war. Salted meat, wool, firewood, and iron were secured in hidden caches across the North. Trade routes were rerouted inland, away from predictable choke points. Barter replaced coin in many regions, insulating the North from fluctuating prices. Most importantly, Jon leaned into winter. Where the South feared scarcity, Jon weaponized it. He knew the North's strength was endurance. The cold that crippled southern logistics strengthened northern discipline. Soldiers trained on reduced rations not to suffer, but to adapt. Civilians were prepared early, before desperation could take root. Winter scarcity became a shield. Tyrion noticed. Within a month, his carefully applied pressure failed to produce the panic he expected. Prices stabilized, not because the market corrected itself, but because the North no longer relied on it. Mercenary companies began refusing southern contracts, citing supply uncertainty. Bravusi bankers complained that northern debts were being paid early or not needed at all. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Jon Snow was not reacting. He was anticipating. Tyrion leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He's starving the market, he realized. Not his people. It was brilliant. Infuriating. Clean. Most commanders, when pressed economically, responded with raids or reckless spending. Jon didn't either. He simply removed himself from dependency. Where Tyrion attacked coin, Jon attacked need. The war had shifted. No longer were victories measured in burned fields or captured banners. Now they were counted in grain silos, warehouse inventories, and contracts never signed. Balance sheets became battlefields. Accountants replaced captains. Ink rivaled blood. And somewhere in the frozen North, Jon Snow was playing the game better than anyone expected. Tyrion could not help but admire it. He thinks like a southern player, Tyrion admitted quietly to himself. But he acts like a northern one. That was the danger. Southern players schemed, but they were greedy. Jon schemed with restraint. He did not overreach. He did not flaunt success. He denied Tyrion the very thing he thrived on, Reaction. The invisible rivalry sharpened. Targaryen began testing Jon with feints. False trade openings, baited loans, rumors of grain shortages that never came. Each time Jon responded with measured indifference. Sometimes he did nothing at all, letting the South exhaust itself, chasing shadows. It was maddening. For the first time in years, Tyrion felt challenged not by arrogance or brute force, but by discipline. As he closed the ledgers late one night, Tyrion smiled faintly, a spark of genuine respect in his mismatched eyes. "So," he murmured, lifting his cup, "the bastard plays Sivas without the board, and still wins." The war of coin was far from over. But Tyrion Lannister now understood the truth. Others were only beginning to grasp. Jon Snow was not merely surviving the game. He was redefining it. Chapter 39, Wolves and Vultures. The war was no longer being discussed in the language of banners and battles. In the halls of the Vale and the Riverlands, it was spoken of in quieter tones over wine cups, behind closed doors, and in chambers where maps lay untouched while letters were read again and again. Lords gathered not to plan rebellion or allegiance, but to measure inevitability. The question was no longer whether the North would endure. The question was who truly commanded it. In the Vale, beneath the high stone ceilings of the Ares lesser halls, banners of falcons hung motionless as the lords argued in measured voices. Robb Stark's name was spoken with respect, king in the north, victor in the field, heir of Winterfell. Yet it was Jon Snow's name that lingered longer in the air, spoken cautiously, as though acknowledging it gave it weight. "He does not lead from the front," one lord observed. "Yet every northern victory bears his mark." Another scoffed, "He is still a bastard." And yet a third replied quietly, "Bastards do not usually reshape wars." They spoke of logistics that never failed, of alliances that held without force, of betrayals anticipated before they could unfold. Some lords began to hedge, sending cautious envoys to Winterfell rather than Robb's camps, offering aid framed as concern rather than allegiance. Others warned against such duplicity, fearing that choosing sides too early or too visibly might prove fatal. The vultures circled, but the wolves did not scatter. In the Riverlands, the debate was sharper, more desperate. These lands had suffered the worst of the war. Burned fields, pillaged villages, broken levees. Lannister cruelty had driven many to the brink, and northern restraint had drawn them back from it. Riverlords gathered in half-ruined keeps, their discussions edged with exhaustion. "Robb Stark fights like his father," one said, honorable, direct. "And Jon Snow fights like winter itself," another countered. Slow, unavoidable. Some feared backing the wrong man. Others feared doing nothing more. What unsettled them most was not northern strength, but northern certainty. The North did not plead, it did not threaten, it did not bargain in desperation. It simply moved forward, and the realm adjusted around it. Jon Snow sent no emissaries demanding loyalty. He sent reports, clean factual summaries of troop movements, supply routes, and projected outcomes. He outlined where the war was moving, which roads would close in winter, which houses would suffer if they delayed decisions too long. There were no promises of reward, no threats of retribution. Only reality. Those who read his messages felt something shift. Jon did not ask them to choose him or Robb. He did not frame allegiance as a favor. He treated it as a matter of timing, of whether they wished to arrive early or late to the inevitable conclusion. Some lords bristled at this. Others felt relief. Fear could be resisted. Bribes could be negotiated. But inevitability? That was harder to defy. Gradually, the wavering stopped. Not because every lord declared openly for the North, but because resistance became impractical. Supply lines adjusted toward northern-controlled routes. Neutral houses delayed answering Lannister calls. Even those who remained officially undecided began behaving as though the North's victory was a matter of when, not if. The political center of gravity shifted. The North became the axis around which decisions turned. In a quiet chamber far from these debates, Jon Snow studied a map marked not with banners, but with hesitations, houses that delayed, roads unused, levies that never arrived. He noted each one not as a target, but as confirmation. Serenia watched him from across the table. "They're choosing," she said. "They're stopping the pretense of not choosing," Jon replied. "And Robb?" Jon's mouth tightened slightly, not in bitterness, but resolve. "Robb remains king. That matters. But they speak your name." "They always will," Jon said calmly. "Names don't rule, outcomes do." Beyond the walls of Winterfell, the war continued, but its shape had changed. The vultures still watched, searching for weakness, circling for opportunity. Yet beneath them, the wolves moved as one, not snapping, not scattering, but advancing with quiet certainty. And as winter deepened, the realm began to understand a truth it had resisted for too long. The North did not demand loyalty. It generated it, not through fear, not through love, but through gravity. Chapter 40, Winter's Shape. POV. Jon, Serenia. Winter had a shape. Jon Snow understood that now. It was not merely snow and cold, not just frozen rivers or shortened days. Winter had a shape because men gave it one through fear, through hoarding, through cruelty, through the desperate choices made when survival eclipsed hope. As Jon stood atop the eastern battlements of Winterfell, wind clawing at his cloak, he could see it clearly in his mind, the war's outline, the realm's fractures, the slow bending of Westeros towards something new and uncertain. The North was winning. That truth no longer surprised him. Lannister armies hesitated. Southern trade faltered. Neutral houses drifted northward like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. Winterfell had become more than a castle. It was a center of gravity. Messages came daily, live bannermen, river lords, merchants, even hedge knights, seeking alignment. The Snow Fox had done what swords could not, made resistance feel pointless. And yet, Jon's gaze lingered on the horizon, where gray sky met white land. Victory, he was learning, did not look like peace. It looked like strain. It looked like people exhausted but unwilling to stop. Systems stretched thin. Old institutions cracking under pressure. They were never built to bear. The realm was breaking. Serenia joined him quietly, as she always did, her presence more felt than heard. She followed his gaze for a long moment before speaking. "You're not smiling," she said. "I rarely do," Jon replied. "That's not what I meant." He exhaled slowly. "The war is turning in our favor, but every report I read, it's not relief I feel. It's weight." Serenia studied him closely. She had seen him in councils, in camps, in the quiet hours before dawn, when plans were formed and rewritten. She knew his silences. This one was heavier than most. "You've spent this war preventing collapse," she said. "Now you're seeing what remains when collapse is avoided." Jon nodded. A realm held together by habits that no longer work. He thought of the Riverlands burned too often to trust any crown, of King's Landing, rotting beneath its own fear, of the Vale, aloof, calculating, waiting to see which future would win. Even the North, strong as it was, carried scars. Houses weakened, traditions strained, loyalties reshaped not by blood, but by competence. "The old order won't survive this," Jon said quietly. "Even if we win outright." Serenia leaned against the battlement beside him. "That's what frightens men like Cersei and Tywin," she said. "Not defeat, irrelevance." Jon's jaw tightened. He had spent so long thinking in terms of survival, anticipating betrayals, countering attacks, preserving Robb's crown, that he had avoided the question waiting beneath it all. "What comes after?" "I never wanted power," Jon said. Serenia did not laugh. She did not dismiss it. "Most people who say that are lying. You're not." "That doesn't change the outcome," he continued. "Every decision I make reshapes the North. Every success pulls more people into our orbit. They don't just want protection anymore. They want structure, stability, answers." "And Robb?" Serenia asked gently. Jon was silent for a moment. "Robb is a good king. An honorable one. But honor isn't enough for what's coming." She let the words hang between them, sharp but honest. "You've built systems," she said. "Supply chains, councils, intelligence networks, laws that adapt instead of break. You've governed without calling it governance." Jon closed his eyes briefly. He could see it all laid out. The Northern Council debating grain allocation, bannermen cooperating without coercion. Soldiers trained not just to fight but to endure. It had happened naturally, out of necessity. "I did it so Robb wouldn't have to." Jon said, and now, he admitted, "it's bigger than Robb, bigger than me." Serenia turned to face him fully. "You can't keep shaping the future while pretending you're not part of it." Jon met her gaze. "If I step forward, I become a target. You already are. If I take a formal role, I threaten Robb's authority." "Only if you compete with him," she countered. "Not if you redefine what authority means." That struck deeper than any accusation. Redefine. Jon had been reacting to the world as it was, countering its worst impulses, steering it away from disaster. But he had never truly allowed himself to imagine shaping it deliberately. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Serenia's voice softened. "Decide what kind of realm deserves to survive this winter." They walked the battlements together as dusk settled, the sky bruised purple and gray. Below them, Winterfell moved with quiet efficiency, soldiers drilling, messengers arriving, civilians working stores and fires. It was not fear that drove them now, it was confidence. Jon saw it clearly then. The North was no longer fighting just to live. It was preparing to lead. "I can't remain unseen forever," Jon said at last. Serenia smiled, not triumphantly, but knowingly. "No, shadows are useful in war, in peace. They breed uncertainty." He thought of Sansa, navigating King's Landing with silk and silence, of Arya, cutting supply lines and expectations alike, of Robb carrying the crown with stubborn resolve, of his father, who was still in a secret prison in King's Landing, of the countless people whose lives were shaped by decisions made in rooms they would never enter. Winter had a shape, and so did the future. Jon Snow straightened, the wind tugging at his cloak, Ghost appearing at his side as if summoned by thought alone. "Then it's time," Jon said quietly, "to stop merely preventing disaster." Serenia waited, "and start deciding," he finished, "what comes after survival." The snow fell softly around them, not as an omen, but as a beginning. Chapter 41. The Lord Tywin Keeps. The cell was not beneath the earth, nor buried in some forgotten dungeon where screams dissolved into stone. It was a chamber of quiet purpose, thick walls, no windows, a single iron-bound door guarded day and night by men who did not speak unless spoken to. Ned Stark had long since realized this was no ordinary prison. It was a vault. He sat on a narrow bed, hands resting on his knees, the chain at his ankle heavy but mercifully short. His beard had grown coarse, streaked with gray, his face lean from measured meals and endless waiting. He had not been beaten. He had not been questioned. No confessions demanded. No threats made. That absence frightened him more than cruelty ever could. Tywin Lannister did not keep men without purpose. Tywin stood on the opposite side of the iron door, hands clasped behind his back as he listened to the guard's report. The man spoke quietly, precisely, no emotion, no speculation. Tywin dismissed him with a nod and entered the chamber alone. Ned Stark rose immediately, despite the stiffness in his leg. "Lord Tywin," he said evenly. Tywin inclined his head a fraction, the closest thing to respect he would ever offer. "Lord Stark." They regarded one another in silence, two men carved from different ages, bound now by the same war. "You have not killed me," Ned said at last, "nor freed me, nor judged me." "No," Tywin replied, "because all three would be wasteful." He took a seat across from Ned, folding his hands with deliberate calm. "The realm believes you dead or condemned. I have allowed that uncertainty to linger. Fear grows best in shadow." Ned's jaw tightened. "My daughters, Sansa lives," Tywin said plainly. "Arya remains unaccounted for." The words struck harder than any blow. Ned closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. "And my son? They march, they win." Tywin's gaze sharpened. "Largely because of the bastard." Ned looked up. "Jon?" "Yes," Tywin said. "Jon Snow." There was no bitterness in his tone, only assessment. Tywin rose and paced slowly. "You are alive for 3 reasons, Lord Stark." He raised one finger. "First, if King's Landing falls, I may require leverage that even your son's victories cannot ignore." A second finger. "Second, your continued existence restrains the North. Martyrs radicalize. Living fathers restrain their children." Ned said nothing, but the truth of it cut deep. "And third," Tywin finished, turning back to him, "because Jon Snow plans wars, but men like you inspire them. I will keep the source." Ned stared at him, fury and clarity warring in his chest. "You think this makes you wise?" "No," Tywin replied. "It makes me prepared." Days later, alone again, Ned pieced together the horror of it. No trial meant no death to rally against. No confession meant no stain to erase. No word meant no certainty. For Robb, for Jon, for the North. Tywin had buried him alive, not in earth, but in ambiguity. And worst of all, his children did not know. Ned sat heavily on the bed, the weight of it crushing his chest. Robb would hesitate where certainty demanded action. Jon would calculate endlessly, chasing fragments that always led back to Tywin's shadow. Tywin was not reacting to the war. He was waiting. Far away in Winterfell, Jon Snow stood over a map marked with false trails and dead ends. Every whisper, every captured messenger, Every intercepted letter ended the same way. Tywin Lannister knows something no one else does. And Robb, pacing beside him, finally voiced what neither had wanted to say. Father's fate was never declared, Robb said quietly. No body, no sentence. Jon's jaw tightened, because Tywin doesn't waste assets. Ghost stirred at his feet, sensing the shift. Somewhere, Jon knew, his father was alive, or being kept so, and Tywin Lannister was counting on the day Jon Snow stepped out of the shadows to come and claim him. The war had gained a new shape, and at its center stood a man who did not swing swords, but kept wolves in cages and called it strategy. Chapter 42, The Kings Who Wait. Dragonstone rose from the sea like a clenched fist, dark and unyielding, its towers carved by fire and salt. Stannis Baratheon stood upon its battlements, staring eastward as waves shattered below. The wind tugged at his cloak, but he did not flinch. He rarely did. War had come to Westeros, but Stannis was not rushing to meet it. He was preparing. Within the stone halls behind him, parchments lay spread across a long table. Genealogies, letters, sworn statements, the careful accumulation of truth. Proof of what he had always known, what duty had demanded he pursue, even when it cost him love, loyalty, and patience. Joffrey Baratheon was no Baratheon at all. Truth is a weapon, Stannis muttered, more to himself than to the silent guards nearby. But only if wielded at the right moment. He had watched the North with a soldier's eye. Reports filtered in regularly of Robb Stark's victories, of an unseen hand guiding the North with unnerving precision. Jon Snow, a bastard in name only, efficient, ruthless when required, controlled. Stannis respected that. He wastes nothing, Stannis said once to Davos Seaworth. Not men, not time, not advantage. If the realm had more like him, it would not be rotting. Yet respect did not mean trust. The North had crowned its own king. That fact alone placed Robb Stark, and by extension Jon Snow outside the law Stannis intended to restore. The realm could not survive divided crowns forever. Not if justice was to mean anything. For now, Stannis waited. He gathered ships, drilled soldiers, sent quiet envoys to lords who still believed in law over popularity. When the time came, he would strike not with spectacle, but certainty. And when he did, the North would have to choose bend to the rightful king, or stand as an obstacle to order. Far to the south, Highgarden bloomed. Where Dragonstone was iron and stone, Renly Baratheon's court was silk, laughter and sunlight. Banners snapped in the warm breeze, displaying the crowned stag in brilliant gold and green. Knights paraded in polished armor. Lords feasted. Songs were sung. Renly stood at the heart of it all, smiling easily, a king already in spirit, if not yet in law. They love me, he said lightly, watching another lord kneel before him. That matters more than parchment. His marriage to Margaery Tyrell had been a masterstroke. Not for love, but for power. The Reach had rallied to him almost overnight, bringing food, gold, and the largest host in Westeros. Renly understood something his brother never would. People followed who they wanted to follow. Yet even amid feasts and games, the North intruded on his thoughts. Robb Stark's name carried weight now. A young king who had not yet lost. A symbol of defiance. A banner others might rally behind if Renly faltered. Jon Snow, however, Renly dismissed, at least outwardly. A clever bastard playing soldier, he scoffed once. Useful to his brother, perhaps. But hardly a kingmaker. Privately, though, unease lingered. Men did not win wars quietly unless they understood something others did not. Both Baratheon brothers watched the North, but through different lenses. Stannis saw a force that must eventually be confronted, subdued, or integrated under lawful rule. Renly saw a rival myth forming, one that could eclipse even his own charm if allowed to grow unchecked. Neither moved yet. They waited, because each understood the same truth, though neither would ever admit it aloud. The war was not finished with the Lannisters, and when it was, the war would turn northward. Toward the wolves, toward the snow fox, toward the question no king could avoid forever. Who would shape the realm that survived the war? Chapter 43, Ghosts Without Graves. The absence was louder than any proclamation. Robb Stark had expected dreaded news of their father's death for months. A public execution. A confession forced before a cheering crowd. A head on a spike, sent north as a warning. That was how the Lannisters worked. That was how power was displayed. But there was nothing. No raven announcing judgment. Nobody returned or paraded. No singer's tale spreading through the realm. Ned Stark had simply vanished. Robb stood in the map room at Winterfell, staring down at the carved table as if it might yield answers. His jaw was clenched, his hands pressed flat against the wood, knuckles white. They would have shown it, Robb said finally, his voice tight. If they'd killed him, they would have shown it. Jon stood opposite him, quieter, colder, his mind already several steps ahead. Ghost lay at his feet, unmoving, red eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the torchlight. Yes, Jon said. They would have needed us to see it. That was the truth. Neither of them could escape. Jon had begun assembling the pattern weeks ago, piece by piece, like a puzzle deliberately missing its center. Cersei had never boasted of Ned's death. Joffrey had never claimed the glory. Tywin had made no declaration at all. Even Sansa's carefully coded messages, passed through a chain of intermediaries, spoke only of uncertainty, of silence, of evasion whenever Ned's name arose. It was not mercy. It was calculation. They're hiding him, Jon said quietly. Not dead. Not free. Preserved. Robb looked up sharply. Why? Jon met his gaze. Because father is more dangerous alive than dead. The realization changed everything. Within days, Jon reorganized their intelligence efforts, not toward battlefields or supply lines, but toward absence. He instructed his agents to look for what wasn't there. Missing prisoner transfers, sealed orders that never reached their destinations, couriers who vanished after speaking Tywin's name. Bribes were offered not with gold but with protection, food and safe passage. Prisoners were questioned gently, never threatened, encouraged to speak freely about routines and rumors rather than secrets. Jon knew fear made men lie. Comfort made them careless. Every trail led to the same dead end. Tywin Lannister. No Gadaler could name the prison. No commander could name the order. No ledger listed Ned Stark among the living or the dead. It was as if Tywin had plucked him from the world and locked him inside his own will. Robb's patience wore thin. This is madness, Robb said during one heated exchange. If father lives, we should strike. Force Tywin's hand. And if we do? Jon asked calmly. What happens to him then? Robb faltered. Jon stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tywin hasn't killed him because father restrains us, because he believes Ned Stark's honor still shapes the North. The moment we make this war desperate enough, father becomes expendable. Silence followed. That night, the brothers stood atop the battlements, winter air biting at their cloaks. Below them, Winterfell slept, safe for now. Too safe. Robb broke the silence first. Do you ever wish you didn't see so far ahead? Jon considered the question. Every day, Robb exhaled slowly. I keep thinking, if father were here, he'd tell us what to do. Jon looked out into the darkness. No, he'd tell us what not to do. That was the cruelest part. Ned Stark's principles were now a weapon in Tywin's hands. As long as he lived, Jon and Robb would hesitate. As long as his fate was uncertain, the North would remain restrained. Moral, measured, predictable. Exactly how Tywin preferred his enemies. Before they parted, Robb turned to Jon, his voice low and raw. If you're wrong, I'm not, Jon said quietly. And if you're right, Jon rested a hand on the cold stone. Then Tywin isn't waiting for our defeat. He met Robb's eyes, the weight of the truth finally spoken aloud. He's waiting for us to become something. Father would never forgive. The wind howled across the battlements, carrying with it the sense of a war no longer fought only for crowns or borders, but for the soul of the North itself. Somewhere far to the south, Ned Stark lived, and Tywin Lannister was patient. Chapter 44, The Wolf and the Rose. The sun dipped low over the Reach, casting golden light across the rolling hills and meticulously tended vineyards. The Tyrell banners fluttered lazily in the mild wind, their green and gold sigils a calm contrast to the chaos that had spread from the north. Yet beneath the serene beauty of Highgarden, a storm of politics churned, subtle but no less dangerous than open warfare. Rhysand Baratheon, youngest of the Baratheon brothers, sat in a carved oak chair within the solar of Highgarden's keep. His posture was easy, almost casual, but every movement carried purpose. He had learned that appearance was as much a weapon as sword or shield. His charm, his smile, his effortless grace. These were his armor. We cannot wait forever, Rensley said, turning to Marguerite Tyrell, who stood near the tall windows, fingers lightly brushing the carved sill. The North grows stronger, Robb Stark consolidates, his brother a shadow behind him, and yet, still they wait. The lords murmur, but they do not act. It unsettles those of us south of the neck. Marguerite's expression was serene, yet her eyes flickered with calculation. She had been observing the north from afar, through messengers, rumors, and fragmented reports. The tales of snow-clad discipline, the meticulous preparation, the snow fox who orchestrated supply lines, ambushes, and intelligence networks, these were unlike anything the Reach had encountered in living memory. "The north is quiet," she said softly, almost to herself, though her words carried a weight that made Rinsley glance sharply. "That frightens me more than armies." Rosierly laughed lightly, a touch forced. "Quiet is only a lull before the storm. If they march south, it will be bloody. If they stay, they will grow in power and influence. Either way, we must choose move decisively or hedge carefully." Marguerite nodded. And yet, to move decisively risks committing the Reach too early. If Jon Snow is the true architect behind the North's strength, then he is not merely a Stark to be opposed. He is an entire strategy in himself. To miscalculate is to court disaster. Resley leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "I understand, Marguerite, but I also understand that public support can be as strong a weapon as armies. I am building legitimacy now, with charm, with spectacles, with the promise of wealth and stability. The Lords of the Reach will follow me because they choose to, not because they are forced. That is a different kind of strength. One Jon Snow cannot yet touch from Winterfell." Margaery's gaze turned outward, toward the distant horizon, imagining the winter-kissed hills of the north. "They do not need to march to demonstrate power," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "Control, preparation, discipline. The North commands loyalty without bloodshed. That is something few southern lords can comprehend, and it unnerves them. Those who are used to armies defining authority will see nothing and yet fear everything." Rinsley considered this, fingers drumming on the table. "Then perhaps our approach should be twofold. 1. Secure my position among southern houses through visible acts, festivals, marriages, feasts, appearances of strength. 2. Observe the North quietly. Gauge Jon Snow's moves and decide whether to ally, oppose, or ignore him." Margaery's lips curved faintly in a small, knowing smile. "And in doing so, we give ourselves time to see how the North reshapes the realm. Your popularity will give you a platform. His efficiency and restraint will give him the North. Both will grow stronger, and eventually the rest of Westeros will have no choice but to respond." Risley chuckled, shaking his head. "So we play a waiting game. Then, all charm and patience, with swords only at the ready if necessary." "It seems tedious." "It is the game of politics," Margaery replied. "Far more dangerous than any battlefield. A single misstep, and all the Reach's faith can collapse. Worse, if the North plays it correctly, it will redefine the rules entirely. Jon Snow is not like other men. He anticipates, prepares, and reacts before others even see the need to move. That is why quiet frightens me more than armies." Rosierly fell silent, considering her words. The warmth of the setting sun did little to ease the chill that had entered his thoughts. In truth, he had underestimated the North. Not Robb, not the Lords, but Jon Snow himself. He had heard whispers, fragmentary reports of the bastard's influence, his cunning, his patience. And now, hearing Margaery speak with such insight, he understood that the quietness of the North was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of meticulous, controlled power. The Lords of the Reach, Margaery knew, would soon see it too. If they did not align with Rensley, they might align elsewhere. Or worse, wait and see what the North could accomplish first. And patience, as Rensley well knew, could be a weapon, but one that cut both ways. She turned fully to him, eyes gleaming with the sharp intelligence of a tyro. "You court popularity, Risley. That is smart. But remember, the North does not need to court anyone. It binds loyalty with discipline, with preparation, with inevitability. Men follow because they must, not because they wish to. If you mistake the quiet for absence, you will be the first to regret it." Rosierly nodded slowly, digesting her warning. "Then we wait, quietly, and yet prepared to act if the North reaches beyond its borders." Margaery's smile deepened, subtle, almost unreadable. "Yes, but know this. The North is patient too, and patience in their hands is lethal." The sun sank below the horizon, leaving the halls of Highgarden bathed in amber twilight. Outside, the Reach remained serene, its fields golden and quiet. Inside, however, the wheels of power turned ceaselessly. Rensley's charm and popularity worked like oil on the gears of politics, but Margozine's side reminded him that power unseen could be more dangerous than power wielded. For now, the North waited silently, a wolf in the snow. The Reach smiled in the sun, a rose in bloom. And somewhere between the wolf and the rose, Westeros held its breath. Chapter 45, A Dragon Far Away. The Red Keep in King's Landing hummed with the constant flow of couriers, messengers, and informants. Tyrion Lannister, Hand of the King, sat in his solar, surrounded by stacks of reports and correspondence from every corner of the known world. The usual reports of supply lines, troop movements, and bannerman compliance had become routine, mundane enough that they barely required attention. But every so often a report arrived that made him pause, tilt his head, and sip his wine more slowly. It was one such report that had come that morning, carried by a merchant vessel recently arrived from the Free Cities. The parchment was poorly sealed, the handwriting hurried and uneven, a sign of either urgency or lack of education, Tyrion thought. He broke the seal carefully and scanned the contents. A girl, Targaryen by name, 3 dragons. Tyrion raised a brow, reading the lines again. The report was vague, fragmented, almost dismissive in tone. The girl in Korth, it read, dragons, fledgling, small, but alive. Local traders, some fear them, some profit from them. She gathers followers, but too few to challenge kings. Distant, exotic, easily overlooked. Ships pass daily, no evidence of army, fleet, or rebellion. Tyrion leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine as he considered the report. Korth was far across the narrow sea, beyond the Free Cities, beyond the grasp of Westerosi influence. The notion of a Targaryen girl with dragons seemed, on the surface, like little more than an exotic curiosity. He knew better. Dragons, no matter how small, were not insignificant. Tyrion had grown up hearing stories of the Targaryens, of conquest, fire, and blood, but the boy king Joffrey was arrogant. The North and Robb Stark were engaged in a separate war entirely, and for now, the girl's threat seemed intangible. Still, even from this distance, Tyrion could sense the possibility. He placed the parchment carefully on the table and scribbled a note. Monitor, no immediate action. Report again monthly. Verify authenticity. Even in his private mind, he began cataloging her as a variable, a future complication in the complex calculations of Westerosi politics. Far across the narrow sea, in Korth, the girl herself was unaware of her growing reputation. Daenerys Targaryen walked through the bustling streets of the port city. Her 3 small dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, nestled safely in crates beneath her cloak or perched quietly on her shoulders. Their wings were not yet strong enough for sustained flight, but they hissed and snapped at anyone who came too close. The city's residents regarded her with a mixture of awe, fear, and curiosity. Wealthy merchants whispered of her as a novelty to be exploited. Nobles debated whether she might become a patron or a threat, and street children gawked at the strange creatures that had once been thought extinct. Daenerys herself felt the weight of every glance. She was young, barely 17 by Westerosi reckoning, but her presence carried a gravity that others could feel even if they could not articulate it. She was learning to wield influence carefully, to gather followers subtly, and to understand that even in exile, perception could shape reality. Yet, at this point, her dragons were fragile, her political power minimal, and her influence localized. A Westerosi army crossing the narrow sea would have been a threat she could not yet withstand. Her survival depended on discretion, cunning, and the loyalty of those she could gather around her. Back in King's Landing, Tyrion's mind worked as it always did, linking fragmentary intelligence, calculating probabilities, and weighing threats. He considered how the North's current battles against the Lannisters might affect a future Targaryen resurgence. Jon Snow, he muttered to himself, leaning closer to his ledgers, is efficient, patient, and anticipates moves before anyone sees them. This girl, if left unchecked, she may become his counterpart on another continent. But for now, she is a curiosity, a distant variable. He instructed his informants to maintain surveillance. Court stocks, merchant transactions, whispers in the taverns, nothing more, nothing less. There was no need to alarm the boy king Joffrey, who could scarcely distinguish between threats he could touch and rumors he could not. Jon Snow, far to the north in Winterfell, received his own fragments of news. A rider arrived from the south, delivering a sealed letter from a Westerosi trader who had recently returned from Pentos and Korth. The letter was brief. Targaryen girl. Dragons. Not yet a force. Heard she gathers a following, but numbers small. No army, no navy. Distant. Something to note. Jon read it carefully, folding the parchment and tucking it into his chest. Serena, who had been watching him as he read, tilted her head. A girl in cart. Jon's gaze was distant. A problem for a world that survives this one. He did not fear her. Not yet. But Jon Snow had learned that even the smallest variables could change the course of events if ignored. He had seen southern lords crumble, neutral houses shift loyalties, and armies fall because someone underestimated a minor factor. Daenerys Targaryen, a girl across the sea, was a future calculation he would add to the ledger of contingencies. Jon's mind returned to the north. Winterfell needed stability, supply, preparation, and loyalty. Daenerys' presence was irrelevant to the current war, but like all threats, real or potential, she would be watched, catalogued, considered. The north could survive for now, but the world beyond would continue to turn, and variables like her could not remain invisible forever. Meanwhile, in Korth, Daenerys studied the streets with a sense of purpose. Every movement of the merchants, every subtle alliance, and every flicker of attention toward her dragons was a lesson. She did not yet command armies, but she was learning to command loyalty. She did not yet wield fire, but she was learning to wield influence, and though Westeros would not yet notice her, her name would eventually reach those capable of understanding the danger she posed. For Jon, for Tyrion, and for all the players on the chessboard of Westeros, Daenerys Targaryen was now recorded as a distant note, a small threat, a curiosity with potential fire. But for the girl in Kars, the world was just beginning. And in time, when dragons grew, when ambition burned, and when Westeros' chaos collided with hers, all would remember that the seeds were planted quietly, invisibly, while the north was still snowbound and the south still scheming. Jon folded the letter and looked out over the frozen fields surrounding Winterfell. Gray skies above and snow thick underfoot. He whispered to Serena, "The world is far larger than this war, but we must prepare for everything it may bring." She nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. Even as the North consolidated, even as the South schemed, even as lords and kings maneuvered, there were forces beyond their sight. Small dragons across the sea that could someday reshape all that they fought for. And so Jon filed the note away in his mind, alongside all other contingencies, ready for a time when survival was no longer enough, and the future demanded action. Chapter 46, The Queen's Last Refuge. POV, Cersei Lannister. Cersei Lannister had always believed fear was enough. Fear of the crown, fear of gold, fear of armies marching beneath lion banners. For years it had worked. Lords bent, cities complied, and enemies broke themselves upon the idea of Lannister power long before swords ever crossed. Now, fear stalled. She stood at a high window in Maker's Holdfast, fingers tight around a goblet of wine she had not yet tasted. King's Landing lay below her, crowded, restless, uneasy. The streets whispered in a way they had not before. No riots, no open rebellion, but an undercurrent of waiting. As if the city itself sensed that something had gone wrong in the grand design of power. The North would not burn. That was the truth gnawing at her. Robb Stark should have been crushed by now. His army scattered, his banners torn down, his name reduced to a cautionary tale. That was how rebellions ended. Quickly, publicly, brutally. Instead, the North endured. Worse, it adapted. Cersei slammed the goblet down onto the stone ledge. Wine sloshed, but did not spill. Jon Snow, she muttered, the name tasting like ash. She had expected a bastard playing at war, some half-trained northern brute clinging to ideals and pride. Instead, she faced a mind that refused every trap. No rash charges, no desperate marches south, no mistakes she could exploit. Every provocation met patience. Every threat met silence. Every attempt to escalate met preparation. Jon Snow did not rage. He absorbed. The North starved her of reaction, and that terrified her more than any battlefield loss. She turned away from the window as footsteps echoed softly behind her. One of her ladies' hands folded, eyes downcast, announced a visitor. Not the king, not Tyrion. Someone else. A quiet man, one of Tywin's men. Cersei dismissed her attendance with a flick of her hand. The man knelt only briefly before delivering his message, voice low and carefully neutral. Lord Tywin wishes you to know, he said, that contingencies remain secured. Cersei's breath caught. She did not ask the question outright. She never did. Instead, she circled it like a predator sniffing blood. Secured how? She asked coolly. The man hesitated, just a fraction too long. The Stark Lord, he said finally, is not dead. The word struck like ice down her spine. Not relief, not triumph. Fear, mid-Stark alive, was not comfort. It was leverage, and leverage in Tywin's hands was never shared freely. Where? She demanded. I do not know, Your Grace, the man replied truthfully. Only that he is held beyond reach. Few are aware. Fewer still would dare speak of it. Cersei dismissed him at once, pacing the chamber as the implications unfurled in her mind. So that was Tywin's game. No execution. No confession, no body displayed to cow the North into despair. Tywin had chosen silence, absence, uncertainty. Ned Stark was not a punishment. He was a resource, and that meant Cersei was no longer holding the most valuable Stark in the capital. Her gaze drifted, unbidden, to another presence in the Red Keep. Sansa Stark. The girl knelt in her chambers even now, sewing, praying, hoping, still clinging to foolish dreams of mercy and knights and royal kindness. But Cersei had once considered her little more than a decorative hostage, a bargaining chip to wave when the North grew unruly. Now, she saw her differently. Sansa was not merely leverage. She was insurance. The King's Landing fell if the mobs rose, if the gold ran out, if Jon Snow finally marched south with that quiet, relentless certainty of his, Cersei would need something no army could take from her. A shield, a reason for the wolves to hesitate. She thought of Sansa's face when she spoke of her father, the fragile hope that still lived there, thin but stubborn. If Ned Stark was alive, hidden, suffering, waiting, then Sansa remained useful in ways Cersei had not fully grasped before. Two Starks, father and daughter, alive, unbroken, unresolved. That was power. Cersei poured herself fresh wine, hands shaking just enough to anger her. She had always believed she was the true architect of Lannister's survival, that Tywin fought wars, but she understood threats. Yet here he was again, playing a deeper game, holding pieces she did not control. And the board was shifting. Reports continued to arrive from the north, stockpiles filled, roads fortified, trade routes rerouted. Winter preparation taken seriously. Lords not defecting, cities not starving, no panic. Jon Snow had removed desperation from the equation, and desperation was what she needed. She imagined King's Landing under siege, not by armies, but by inevitability. The gold drying up, the people turning, the banners wavering, and when that day came, she knew one truth with perfect clarity. She would not die here. Not for Joffrey, not for the city, not for a throne that had already begun to crack beneath her feet. She began quietly planning escape routes. Ships, loyal only to her. Caches of gold hidden beyond the city. Names of men who would not betray her if the price was right. She had done it once before, in her youth, imagining failure as an intellectual exercise. Now, it was survival, and survival demanded hostages. Cersei stopped before a mirror, studying her reflection. Still beautiful, still regal, still dangerous, but no longer unchallenged. She reached a decision then, not a scream, not a rage, but something colder, more focused. If the wolves came south, if Jon Snow decided patience had ended, if Robb Stark demanded answers the Lannisters could not give, she would take what they loved. Sansa Stark would not remain a girl in a tower. She would become a traveling shield, a living promise that any blow struck against Cersei would be answered with Stark blood. And if Tywin fell, if King's Landing burned, then Ned Stark would come with her too. Whether Tywin intended it or not, she whispered it softly, as if the walls themselves needed to hear. If the wolves come, I will take their girl and their father with me. Outside, the bells of King's Landing rang faintly in the distance. Not in alarm, not yet. But Cersei Lannister had learned at last that safety was no longer guaranteed by power alone. And so, she prepared, not to rule forever, but to survive whatever came next, carrying the last refuges she could claim with her into the dark.
Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed this reimagined story and audiobook style presentation, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this. New stories and alternate scenarios are updated regularly. Now see you in the next video.